This is
Imagine a
absolutely
family
exquisite.
gathering,
I
but
agree, the
instead of
flavor is
people,
incredible.
every guest is a whiskey. The living room feels warm and lively. Laughter fills the air, and crystal glasses sparkle on the table.
This
At the head of the
8-year-old
table
is
sits the
exceptional.
ancestor of the
It
entire
really
family.
is.
A name
toast
so
to the
old it
host.
almost sounds mythical. Uisgi Beatha. In ancient Scottish Gaelic, this phrase means water of life. Over time, that long and difficult name was shortened into a word much more familiar to us today, whiskey. But like any large family, the children of Uisge Beatha are far from identical. They share the same roots, born from grains, water, and yeast. Yet each one has developed a completely different personality. If you walked into this party, two characters would quickly stand out from the rest. In one corner of the room, there's a guy talking loudly, laughing easily,
This
holding
one is
his glass
definitely a
high while
storyteller,
telling a
bold
story
and
that makes
complex.
everyone around him
Absolutely.
burst
To the
into
quiet ones
laughter.
and the loud ones.
That's Bourbon.
Ladies and gentlemen,
Bourbon
thank you
is
all for
the
coming tonight.
outgoing
We celebrate
type you
good
see at
health and
almost
keep it
every
Cheers.
party. He comes from Kentucky, a place where the summer heat can be so intense that the air itself seems to shimmer.
So I
And
told
like
him, I said,
many
"Look, if you
people
think
from
you
the
can handle it,
American
be my
South,
guest." And wouldn't you know, he
Bourbon
dropped
has
the
a
whole tray of
naturally
beignets
warm
right
and
there on the
welcoming
street.
personality. Part of that personality actually comes from what he eats, by law. Bourbon must be made from a grain mixture that contains at least 51% corn. That number might sound a little technical, but imagine it this way. If you cook a pot of grain porridge where more than half of the ingredients are corn, the natural sweetness of corn will dominate the flavor. That sweetness becomes the foundation of bourbon's character.
By
As the
law,
spirit
bourbon
ages
must contain
inside
at least
charred oak
51%
barrels,
corn, forming the
compounds from the
foundation of what
wood
is
slowly
known as the
dissolve
mash
into the
bill.
whiskey. Some molecules, such as vanillin, create that familiar vanilla aroma. Others contribute notes of caramel, honey, and sometimes even a hint of baked pastry. That's why when you smell a glass of bourbon, it can feel like standing in a kitchen where someone has just pulled a tray of caramel pastries out of the oven. It's not a coincidence that bourbon is often described as sweet, even though it actually contains no sugar. But at this party, there's another character as well. He doesn't talk much. He stands quietly near the window, gazing out at the imaginary mist outside, while taking slow, thoughtful sips. That is Scotch. If bourbon is the loud guy in a denim jacket, Scotch feels more like an old philosopher from the Highlands. He comes from Scotland, where cold winds sweep across grassy hills and the sky is often wrapped in a thin veil of mist. Scotch's favorite grain isn't corn, but barley, and for centuries, the Scots have used a very special fuel to dry that barley before distillation peat. Peat is essentially plant material that has slowly decayed over thousands of years and compressed in cold, wet boughs. When it burns, it produces a very distinctive smoke. During the drying process, that smoke clings to the barley and carries with it compounds called phenols, which smell like campfire smoke, tear, and sometimes even something that reminds people of medical bandages. That's why drinking certain types of Scotch, especially those from the island of Islay, can feel very different from drinking bourbon. Instead of caramel and vanilla, you might encounter aromas of smoke, sea air, and even that slightly medicinal character. For newcomers, the smell can be surprising, even shocking. But for lovers of Scotch, that smoky intensity is not a flaw. It's the signature of its personality. The whiskey family gathering was starting to get interesting. On one side stood bourbon warm, sweet, and easygoing. On the other side was Scotch, quiet, smoky, and a little mysterious. Both were born from the same ancestor, yet they grew into completely different personalities. But there was another invisible character at this party, a presence that didn't speak, didn't hold a glass, yet quietly shaped everyone's personality. That character was the weather.
Wow, that is
Imagine the
incredibly
wooden
smoky.
barrel where
It's like
whiskey
drinking campfire.
ages
I know,
as
right?
if
It
it
hits
were
you
a
immediately, but
giant
I love
lung.
it.
When
heat on this
temperatures
is
rise,
remarkable.
the
Such a
liquid
rich,
inside
lingering
expands
smoke,
and
indeed,
seeps
perfectly
deep
balanced
into
with
the
the oak.
wood. When temperatures fall, the whiskey contracts and pulls back out, carrying compounds from the oak with it. In Kentucky, summer temperatures can climb above 30 degrees Celsius. every day. The whiskey inside the barrel is almost like it's exercising. It expands, contracts, then expands again. With each cycle, the spirit pushes deeper into the oak, extracting more flavor. That's why bourbon tends to mature relatively quickly.
The most critical
in just 4 to 8 years,
time.
It can already develop remarkable depth of flavor. Scotland tells a different story. The climate there is colder and far more stable. The barrels breathe slowly, almost like someone meditating. The exchange of flavors happens gradually, sometimes over decades. That's why a 1-2-year-old Scotch is often considered quite young in its own world. Interestingly, this can make bourbon sometimes appear older than its actual age. A 6-year-old bourbon may carry roughly the same amount of oak influence as a 12-year-old Scotch. Not because bourbon is made better, but because Kentucky's climate accelerates the aging process. Returning to our imaginary party, you might picture bourbon as the lively storyteller standing in the center of the room. Scotch, meanwhile, is the gentleman seated quietly in the corner speaking less. But every word carries depth. Both have their own charm. And the fascinating part is that there's no right or wrong choice.
Notice
Some
the
people
color
enjoy
difference.
the warm
bourbon is much
sweetness of
darker,
bourbon,
almost syrupy.
like listening
Scotch,
to a
however,
story
offers
beside a
cleaner,
glowing
brighter
fireplace.
aroma.
Others prefer the smoky complexity of Scotch,
aged to perfection,
like
just
reading
like
a
fine
classic
story.
novel on a
Cheers.
rainy night. So the next time you hold a glass of whiskey, remember, you're not just drinking a spirit. You're meeting a character. Maybe it's an outgoing bourbon, speaking through notes of caramel and vanilla. Or perhaps it's a quiet Scotch gentleman, telling stories through smoke, wind, and time.
So,
The only
which whiskey story
question
would you like
left
to hear
is
tonight?
simple.
Perhaps the one about
Whose
the bootlegger
story would
or
you
the
like to
senator?
hear tonight?